YouTube and Facebook. Welcome this evening. We have MP Woodward joining us. I'm really excited to get into this conversation. So we're going to get the music started, let everybody in. Thank you for joining us. Evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to VBC Scuttlebutt for Monday, September 8th. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. It's great to see you all here this evening. I'm going to go ahead and let's see here. I'll find Brad Washabaugh. Brad, I'm going to make you co-host just so in case we ever run into a power outage here, you'll be able to continue on with the questions for this evening. It's great to see you all. Veterans Breakfast Club. Thank goodness we're not going up against the Steelers tonight, but I have a feeling like we'd still draw a heck of a crowd for our guest, MP Woodward. MP, if you want to say hello.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Uh, if you're new to us, we are a nonprofit based in Western PA, and our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We've been doing this since 2008, mostly as in-person breakfast, as MP pointed out. He's like, "You're a breakfast club, but you're hanging out in the evening." I said, "Yep, that's how we do." We usually have in-person breakfast in and around the Western PA, Pittsburgh region. But we've been doing these Zoom programs on Monday nights and Thursday nights for quite a while. Monday nights are our scuttlebutt. We kind of touch on all things veterans, all things military. And Thursday nights are our Greatest Generation live program, which will be back because Glenn is back this coming Thursday, as we will be remembering 9/11 this coming Thursday. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But as you know, Todd, Executive Director, and Glenn were both in Europe doing a battlefield tour. I believe they are back now. Todd's, I think, recovering from that tour. So we'll see him next Monday. But I want to thank you all again for joining us. And yeah, I'll do a little station break later to tell you what we have coming up on our schedule. But I want to go ahead and introduce MP Woodward. He is an author of not only his own series, the Handler series, but the recent Jack Ryan Jr. series. And I have to say that I have a little bit of excited energy tonight because I would say that I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to these the one guy versus everything type deal. I love it. I like the Jack Ryans. I like the Jack Bauers, the James Bonds, the Ethan Hunts. They're all sort of exciting to me. And I talked with MP a couple of years back on my Scuttlebutt podcast about his Handler series, and I remember him saying at that time, "Yeah, I'm going to be moving and doing some Tom Clancy." And you guys, the three novels he has out so far are excellent. We're going to get into them, but I'd like to start with MP's military career because MP started as Naval Intelligence and has a really interesting career to talk about this evening. Also, and I'll throw this in for our Western PA guys, MP, you said your mother's family is from Punxsutawney.
Yes, big family in Punxsutawney.
So you know the Pittsburgh region, you know our Appalachia area.
I have a lot of relatives who were coal miners. Yes.
That's my history. I hear that. So MP, let's dive into your naval history background. I'd love to ask, how did you get involved in the Navy? When did you enlist?
I was commissioned in 1990, and I first I graduated high school in like 1986, and was always very interested in the Navy, always very interested in history, and it seemed to me that I think I grew up watching World War II novels or reading World War II novels, and my dad was a big fan of World War II movies,
Mhm.
Midway, things like that. Watching Black Sheep Squadron, and to me that was just really cool. And for a while we lived in San Diego, and I was around the Navy a lot, so I applied for a an NROTC scholarship, and that's how I put myself through school. So that's how I ended up as an ensign back in 1990.
So it was like World War II Pacific interest, like history interest that brought you to Navy. Why didn't you go like Air Force or Army?
Yeah, it was that historic. It was a love of the sea and the ocean, and I like to sail. And being around it, I think in San Diego. But I liked a lot of the movies too. So that you can't underestimate that appeal that you get on young minds, or those impressions you put on young minds in Hollywood.
And you wanted to be in intelligence, or did you want to be a pilot to be start?
I actually started off as in flight school, and I was in Pensacola after commissioning, and was injured during the T-34 syllabus. And so then, based on that, I had to do something else, and I ended up as an intelligence officer.
Do you mind if I ask how you got injured?
Well, it's not a very glamorous story. There's nothing super heroic about it, but suffice to say that my back was injured.
Mhm. But you wanted to go in as an officer, right?
Yes, yes. And so I was already, when you go to flight school, you're already a commissioned officer. So you're, a brand new ensign, more or less.
Did you like the ROTC?
Yeah, no, I loved it. I thought it was a great thing. At the time, I didn't get into the Naval Academy, which was my first choice. And their loss, of course. But I did get into the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, and it kind of came down to doing that versus the Navy. But at the end of the day, I wanted to be a Navy officer more than a Coast Guard officer, so I went that route, and it was a very rewarding experience. One of the best decisions I ever made.
Uh, so, oh, sorry. I'm sorry, you got a scholarship through NROTC, and this is for my non-veterans in the room. How does that kind of work? You got it because you
Oh,
joined NROTC?
yeah, no, no, no. It's a great deal. So back then, I think it still works the same way. You can apply to the Navy for an NROTC a 4-year scholarship,
Hmm.
and when you do that, you are not in the reserves. You're in the reserves while training, but your designation is that once you finish, because you're a scholarship student, you'll be regular Navy, USN, not USNR. And they pay for all the school, they pay for all the books, they give you an allowance, all that kind of stuff. They own you in the summers. And
Hmm.
if you're a grade point, and you have to take a lot of extra courses and things, typically in the sciences. And if your grade point average goes below, I think it was a 2.5, you are shipped off to the fleet, because they've been, paying for you all that time. And I
Hmm.
remember that happening to a couple guys. That was always a good motivator to do well.
And did you come from a military family?
Not particularly, no.
Were you always interested in writing? Were you writing even at this time?
Yeah, I was. I think that had a big influence on me liking the Navy. My two favorite books when I was in high school, one was The Cane Mutiny, another was Tales of the South Pacific, and then I read Winds of War and War and Remembrance, and was just totally taken with the sweep of history and the magic that those writers, Herman Wouk and James Michener, could create, and that made me very excited and made me want to write. So I did try to write. I mostly tried to write, not so much while I was in training, but later when I was off on ships and had some time and some observations and things of that nature.
Um, how did you mentioned that you were going pilot, but when you got injured, how did your career trajectory change? Why did the Navy decide to keep you, and how did you sort of make that transition?
Well, they recognized that the greatest weapon was my mind, so they put me in intelligence. No, basically, you become physically disqualified for flight, which can happen to a lot of people for various reasons. Eyesight, for example, back then. Then you apply to other designators, so you could be a surface warfare officer, a bunch of different things. I was most interested in intelligence. If I was kind of a bookish person, I was kind of I really liked history. I liked the idea of intelligence, and as an aspiring writer, I thought it would be kind of a fascinating field to get into.
So you knew a little bit about it before choosing that.
Not a whole lot. Just I liked the sound of it mostly.
Yeah. Okay. So you go to intelligence. What year is this?
That was 91.
Okay. So we're looking around like Cold
Desert
War
Storm.
era, Desert
Desert,
Storm.
yeah. Yeah, so that's the thing, is that when I entered the Navy, it was 1986, really, is when you begin the training pipeline, height of the Cold War, John Layman, 600 ship Navy, right?
Mhm.
It was a very much of a Cold War driven time. And that was of real interest to me, politically, et cetera, at that age. By the time I left, by the time I was actually commissioned, the Berlin Wall had fallen, et cetera. And we had, even the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991.
Mhm.
So all of that was kind of happening while I was in flight school and then in intelligence training. The other thing that happened in that period, of course, was Desert Storm. And that was actually um, a really interesting time to be in intelligence training because for the first time since really, Vietnam or lesser operations like say Grenada, et cetera, it was like a full scale American military deployment. And so many of these tactics and strategies that had been under development for years that we'd been learning about, and not just our own, but on the sort of the Soviet doctrine side, all of a sudden we saw those coming into play. And so, for example, this is ancient history now, so we can kind of talk about it. But the classic concept is an integrated air defense system, right? And so most of the Soviet systems, rather than having pilots who had a fair degree of autonomy or airborne controllers, they had these forward operating bases with ground control intercept people that would send fighter planes around, et cetera. And so they would have that, and then they would have layered surface-to-air missile systems. Really hadn't changed all that much from Vietnam. Was probably largely developed in kind of the Vietnam War area, really kind of the 1970s. And so seeing the American forces sort of roll that back with a combination of behind the line stuff to take out early warning radars, surface to air missile radars, and then being able to shoot down the throat of enemy radars with anti-radiation missiles, harm missiles, all that stuff, and kind of clear the IADs and then open it up for offensive stuff. Keep in mind too, this was really, I think, the first time we ever saw stealth in action, the F-117 Nighthawk. It was the first major deployment, I think, I could be wrong about that, of laser guided bombs. And that ended up being a big part of the strike planning that I was to do later. So I feel it was a watershed moment for a lot of reasons. Also, I think we can say now, 30 years later, 35 years later, that it was actually something that probably kicked off the period of time that we're in now, and that we showed to the Chinese, I think that, oh my gosh, we have got a lot of work to do if we're ever going to be a peer power. And so Desert Storm is often cited by, today's adversarial powers as the moment that they realized politically that they needed to change tack if they were ever going to match the United States on the battlefield.
It seems like from just your answer here that it was a very exciting time to be in intelligence then.
Oh yeah, yeah, it was a super exciting time. That was also, it was a very optimistic period as well because we had, NATO expanded from whatever it was to, it like doubled the number of countries. All of a sudden, globalization, which has become something of a dirty word depending on your kind of economic political outlook. At the time, many of us, I'm sure, recall, right? There was this great division between the Soviet centrally planned economies and the Warsaw Pact economies, and those of the West. And what we started to see was a great deal of interest in privatization, et cetera. Not all of it was done right, in Russia, unfortunately. We had oligarchs basically bought up all the shares of the newly privatized companies, and that's kind of why Russia is somewhat corrupt today, is largely because that happened. But
Mhm.
it was nonetheless, I think, a period of major shifts in world history.
I always like to ask veterans, like, as you were, coming into your MOS or into your job, how much of like world events were you aware of? And did you feel like you were a little more prepared going into intelligence for what you were about to experience?
Well, a lot of the Soviet dissolution, I was still, I feel like I guess it was that uh, there started to be rumblings when we were still in intelligence school. And at the time, you're learning about US capabilities in terms of intercepting communications, et cetera.
Mhm.
And so getting those perspectives, we would have amazing guest speakers. I mean, it was like being at a significant university. And we would have major guest speakers come in and give perspectives on this at a policy level from DC. And so, as a young commissioned officer who's like 23 years old, 24 years old, being in front of that, all of a sudden I was hyper aware of it. And it wasn't always, hindsight's 2020. It wasn't always like, oh, this is gonna turn out great. There were times there when it was a real question as to who was going to end up controlling the Soviet Union, what were going to happen to, nuclear weapons, right? Et cetera. So yeah, it was a really interesting time to be going into that career.
Al asked in the chat, what was your main source of intelligence from the air, on the ground, other? I know we did a program about like TARPs here, but the surveillance system that was underneath the F-14 Tomcats.
Uh-huh. Yeah. That depends. So the answer to that question would depend. When I was deployed, in the intelligence field, when you end up being deployed, I ended up on the USS Carl Vinson. I was an air wing intelligence officer, and we were very much the pointy end of the spear. So by this period, think about like what happened in Somalia in 1993. I think we were in the Persian Gulf around that period. We were also uh, involved in the geopolitical end of things in Korea. I don't know if everybody remembers when Jimmy Carter went over there in 1994, for example, but I remember being on deployment and they sent us over there. So in those cases, the sources of intelligence were all national assets. So you would get, things that had come in and were coming to you from the NSA or the CIA or other national intelligence offices. So I would call that sort of like secondary sources that is produced intelligence. You also, though, if you are closer to like a battlefield kind of thing, then your sources of intelligence are going to be around sensors, SIGINT, right? We talk about signals intelligence. So it's going to be national collection systems that at that point in history, we were seeing displayed in real time, kind of for the first time, really, because computers digitization was fairly new. So we had these big Sun microsystems and things like that spread all over the air wing and the aircraft carrier, et cetera, where we could make decisions about things we were seeing, whether that's a surface to air missile, a ship somewhere out there, et cetera. I think it was a time when digitization was happening. It was the first use of what became the internet. People tend to forget that the U.S. Department of Defense actually created the internet, and so we called it Intel Link at the time. It may even still exist under that name, but that fusion of analysis from national entities as well as direct sensors was something we were doing in real time. And I think at that moment, now that I've never gotten that question before, but as I look back on it with some perspective, I think that was all very, very new. We were kind of making up the rule book as that was happening.
Can you define for me a bit about what signals intelligence is?
Sure. Signals intelligence is this umbrella term. It's funny because I have to do this in every book, right? Because we always talk about SIGINT and you always have to kind of like redefine it. But signals intelligence is a blanket term, and underneath that is electronic intelligence. And so, the electronic intelligence or ELINT is things like, hey, a radar just went off in Libya, some satellite somewhere, that's an American collection system, saw that radar, can identify what that radar is, and that pops up, on your screen, right? So
Mhm.
that's electronic intelligence. Um, Communications intelligence is another form of signals intelligence. That's comment, and that's the National Security Administration. And there's a third one who, just because I happen to be live on this, I can't recall, but there's various classifications of all of those are emanations or signals of one kind or another, and they all go into feeding these databases.
What did you think of Intel Link when it first came up? I'm sure it was sort of like this foreign language, this internet that, seemed like
Yeah.
it had to have felt very foreign.
It was amazing. I mean, it was I I I think, like, say in high school, I had a Commodore 64 and you were doing stuff with like DOS, so command line prompts. And by the time you're in college, it was probably really early Windows and, kind of lame. I don't remember when Windows first came out, but let's just say it was around that period. So you were first starting to see graphical user interfaces. And now, here you are on seeing browsers. You're like, what the heck is a browser? And links. What is HTML, right? This was all brand new stuff. And, you know, pretty much you're on an aircraft carrier and you're able to look at the admiral or the air wing commander. They're saying we need an analysis on so and so, or we need to plan a strike around whatever. You go to these workstations and you can start now hitting links and getting into the national systems to see, well, what's been happening there. So the amount, just like in our regular lives, the amount of information that all of a sudden was coming to us was kind of impressive.
How did you keep up with your training at that point? If everything is so new and everything is sort of progressing very quickly, did they just specialize you, or did you have to sort of become a jack of all trades?
No, we were kind of jacks of all trades. I mean, at that point, that was pretty early in my career, and at that point, that was really about strike planning intelligence. And so I don't think this is not classified in any way, but certainly back then, as an aircraft carrier sailed over the horizon, there was a national list of potential scenarios. And so there was a lot of scenario planning that happened. Like, hey, what happens if India and Pakistan go at it? Hey, what happens if there's a tsunami in Bangladesh? Like, they were all over the map. And a large portion of what intelligence officers did, along with the senior officers, was to plan contingencies around, various offensive, defensive, or other things like rescues or evacuation operations and so on. So that was like a big part of what we did, and learning that on the fly. Well, I guess that's what we were doing. It wasn't necessarily something that you were trained, but it was like, hey, a capability happened. These guys would fly onto the ship and they would say, you got these terminals now, here's what they can do. And there was usually some expert who would kind of just tell you. But that it was a lot of on the job training, I suppose, is the short answer.
I want to get back to that in just a second, but Brad, you asked a question that I wrote down for this evening was what makes a good intelligence officer, and what qualities did you have that made you a good one?
Um, well, that presupposes that I was a good one, but I would say that there's I think attention. I think it's a lot like in business or being a good manager. In that you have to listen to who your internal stakeholders are. And for me, the internal stakeholders were the squadron commanders and the battle group commanders, the admiral, etc. Now, certainly by dint of a hierarchical organization, you kind of have to listen to them, but that's not the same as really trying to understand what is it you need, like how can I really help here, and getting to the bottom of that, and really being a part of that organization where you can sense and respond. I would say that's the first thing. Second thing is, I think, a natural curiosity and acceptance that it can be a field with rapidly evolving technology, and not being a Luddite or wanting to, like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do it this old fashioned, that kind of thing. So basically being a proactive learner. And I think the third thing is being a natural skeptic. That it would be very easy to say, "Oh, wow, look at that. We just observed this. This must be what's happening." And a lot of times, I think people don't understand that one of the reasons we used to talk about this, that one of the reasons there's some tension between intelligence, various competing intelligence organizations. Like there's a lot of intelligence organizations. And the downside to that could be, oh, there's going to be a turf war. The CIA might say, stay in your lane, we do that. You go over here, you do that. They might say that to the FBI, as kind of famously happened. But on the positive side, it provides alternate points of view and alternate analyses that can then be compared and contrasted, and hopefully to define or divine what we would call the ground truth. So I think that being open to other points of view is that third criterion.
You mentioned the one ship that you served on. Did you serve on a multiple surface ships?
I did. So when you end up with an air wings ultimately deploy on aircraft carriers, and then sometimes they move around, and so your primary allegiance is actually to the air wing. Uh, and then as I moved on in my career, I was also on the USS Blue Ridge, which was a command ship based out in Japan.
Brad asked an excellent follow-up question to the last one. How should a commander use an intelligence officer?
Yeah, I, that's a topic that would come up now and then, and at least among intelligence officers. And there was this, I can remember this saying that was like, what you don't want to hear somebody say is, I don't, that's not very good intelligence. I know good intelligence when I see it, right? Because it's like, look, you have to work with the information that's available, and sort of accept the truth for what it is. I think commanders can have, particularly in contingency planning, they can have all kinds of biases. You can have a recency bias, you could have a confirmation bias. You could have a bias against technology or for technology. And so I think that it gets back to the listening to multiple possible scenarios and threats, because nobody should be able to say definitively, well, this is what's going to happen, right? You don't know. You can assign sort of probabilities to it. You can assign facts, but I guess it's the ability to discern facts from opinions.
I'm going to make a note of that. This is what's going to happen because I feel like that's going to come into play later when we talk about like Jack Ryan Jr.
Well, yeah, as a novelist, I get to do that. Sure.
Absolutely.
I'm writing fiction.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to get back to this idea of gaming things out because it seems very interesting to me that a commander would ask you, "Hey, let's game this out." Were you ever in those instances sort of nervous, like in a way, like if you created some scenario and thought, "Boy, if things really go this way, like we're screwed. Like things could go really sideways if I game what happens is what I think might happen."
I don't think that I would say that would be much more at a senior decision maker level. And, I was a person helping that senior decision maker. So it seems pretty unlikely to me that, I suppose if I and my team got something really, really wrong to where that decision maker is doing something, that's just terrible. But there were so many checks and balances and sources that it's hard to imagine that at the level that I was.
Can you now we think back to like China's provocations of Taiwan, but like can you lead us through if you're able to like the any of like the contingencies or war games that you worked out? Give us like an example of how that came about, like what the process was?
Yeah, I think it's long enough ago that I don't think it matters that all that much. But if you think about the tensions that were happening in around then, North Korea was a big one. At the time, they didn't yet have nuclear weapons, and it was much like it is with Iran today around how do we stop them from getting nuclear weapons. And so, a contingency plan would be around what military options do we have for North Korea? Or, if there were, if another, if you recall, like the Ernest Will exercises of the 80s, when the Vincennes shot down an Iranian airliner. There were a lot of naval tensions in the Persian Gulf with Iran. And so much of what we would look at would be like keeping the sea lines of communications open. What if Iran acted up? What if some other country decided to close down the Strait of Hormuz or something? Things of that nature. And we've all seen enough movies to where somebody goes to the White House and the president or the national security advisor says, I want options, you're right. And
Mhm.
at the end of the day, those options are the things that we were working out ahead of time. So trying to think through what the 50 or so scenarios would be. By the way, when I say that, it makes it sound like we came up with the 50 or so scenarios. They actually came down from the national what's known as the National Command Authority around, here are the 50 or 100, whatever it was, scenarios that we want you to game out.
Uh, Brad in the chat, how would you handle a situation where a commander looks for too much certainty when a decision is needed now?
Uh, I, as a young junior officer, I think my ability to tell them to get off it, is limited. But I think that is something that would be a failure of a commander to act. I'm, in my role as an intelligence officer, I would simply say, look, here's what the odds are. Here's what, the best assessment is the word we always used, would be here. As a commander, I think that commander has to weigh the risk versus the reward of acting with the information you have versus not acting. But I was never that commander with the finger on the trigger.
Hmm. Al asked, and this is interesting because I think I have a follow-up to this, is he says, I would imagine technological intelligence like satellites, etc., is much more reliable than battlefield intelligence, aka from a captured enemy, or am I missing something?
Yeah, that's another one of those ints. We talked about SIGINT. A captured battlefield person is human. And I think it all gets down to the level at which an asset is operating. If you're an ODA team, a Green Beret team in the Army, and you're way over the horizon, deep in enemy territory, you know more of what's going on around that valley than some analyst at the CIA. Now, if a surface to air missile goes off in that valley, yeah, that's going to come up. But if you have a captured person, I think that operator is the best judge of that human, at that moment.
Mhm.
But I think that yes, there is a reliability factor around technical intelligence that is very fact-based. I mean, you can say, look, um, you cannot debate that radar just went off. We don't necessarily know why it went off. We can sort of assign, reasons as to why it did it. That's different than human, where a person might have a reason to lie, for example, right? So it's just a very different style of intelligence, and it's why the CIA is really at a national level. They're the specialists in figuring out human, just like the NSA is at a national level, the specialists in communications intelligence and really signals intelligence in general. The CIA is for human.
And we have to, I think, as a group here, we have to think about the era that MP was in, gathering maybe technological intelligence, and that our satellites at that time might have been advanced for that point. But even think about today and what our satellites are able to pick up or zoom in on. If we can, we can look at a license plate, from space and be able to have instant information about this. Was it difficult at that time to parse out technological intelligence because of just like how advanced I want to say it was, or
I,
not yet advanced?
yeah, I would think about it this way. In the 70s, there were good advances in camera technology, for example. And so satellites might have really good imagery enhancement. But there was a time when they were, I think it was I'll just say this about the Russians. I remember learning about this, that they would have to find ways to get the film back to the ground, right? There was no digital transmission. This thing was coming down, right? And if you think about the U-2 flights in the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The guy would come back, he would analyze the film, and so on and so forth. And so there was a whole the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC. They would look at that imagery intelligence, that came in from that kind of stuff. So the biggest challenge was really when I was in was we were at the dawn of digitization, and along with digitization always comes digital communications. And so bandwidth was a frequent topic. How
Hmm.
much bandwidth does the ship have? And so I remember we had a machine that is probably a relic today, but it was called FIST, the Fleet Imagery Surveillance Terminal. And, its whole job was to download a satellite image, and like it was a big deal at the time. But as you can imagine, because the pipe through which those data communications are happening was so narrow at the time that the quality of that imagery it wasn't good, right? So all these were growing pains into the great, digitization that we all now live in.
And this is my follow-up for the technological intelligence, when you sort of see the advent of AI as a former intelligence officer, does it scare you, AI, or does it seem like this could be something that could help as
Yeah, that's a great question. It doesn't scare me in terms of analysis, because I think it can pull sources from databases so rapidly that, things that humans might have had to think to do or that could take some time to do can get there really rapidly. The danger, of course, would be relying too much on it, taking whatever it says as, absolute truth. But as a research tool, I think that it's massive. And to me, in that sense, it's really just the next stage in computing. There are other things that worry me about AI, but used in that context, not so much.
Ben Wright, former U.S. Air Force pilot, retired. He says here in the chat, the U.S. Air Force once had a mission to catch film canisters from the air that were ejected from satellites in space.
I love it. Thank you for your service, sir. And that sounds like a tricky maneuver. I get inspiration in writing by watching a lot of military documentaries, and I was watching one on the F-4 Phantom, and they were talking about how the Air Force had this new, supersonic interceptor, and one of the first missions they had was that they needed to monitor, I forget, I think it was the Mercury astronaut program, and so the rocket was lifting off, and they were like, we can never get imagery as to what's happening on the outside of the rocket. We need to do that to get better. So they ordered these two F4s to come flying in supersonic and then like go like this and start taking pictures of the rocket as it's, heading towards outer space. They're interviewing this guy. You're like, man, oh man. Yeah. The Air Force got to do some crazy stuff back then.
Ben, I asked you if you got to be a part of any of those missions. If you did, feel free to chime in. Um, so after working in where was it, the U.S. Indo-Pacific time,
Mhm.
were you in for a bit longer after that, or when did you get out?
Well, so I ended up with a U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and had kind of this wargaming job, which was really interesting and fun because you got to go around to a lot of different commands. And then I got out because at the time it was not a growth industry, right? The military was shrinking. Just as I got in, as the Cold War was ending, they all kind of figured out that, oh, well, now these economies are growing. We don't have the threats that we used to, and now we're going to enjoy the quote unquote peace dividend. And so the big navy that John Lehman built up started to become the smaller navy. And there were all kinds of programs to just incentivize officers to leave, frankly, at the time. And that was true in my career field. It was true for pilots. It was true for everybody. At the same time, there was a lot of competition in the private sector, and it was a brilliant time to be entering the private sector. And so I went into a long career in tech, after that, and kind of, I suppose, have the Navy to thank for that.
So I want to sort of transition here. I told you guys it was really interesting. And in my first conversation with MP, I said that I was so green in talking with veterans that I was like, I went back and listened to that and said, I missed so much of your service. It was like there are so many more questions that I should have or thought should have thought of. I'm glad we got more into it tonight because it really is interesting, exciting stuff. And especially sort of bleeds into your writing career. Um, and I know that we're sort of here to talk about your writing career as a whole. Mainly, we brought you on to talk mainly Tom Clancy, but I do want to go back to like your beginnings with the Handler and Dead Drop and say like, how did you start into this genre and what made you decide on this and publish your first book?
Well, I had tried a couple times to write while I was in the Navy, and because that was military fiction sort of interested me. And then when as my life went on and got super busy, and all of a sudden you're raising a family, you're an executive, you're no time, zero. And then later in my career, I ended up at Amazon, and I ended up at Amazon Prime Video, and I was on planes a lot, and things of that nature. And while I was there, I got closer to what we call in the industry, creators, right? Showrunners, or the writers of shows and things like that. And I wasn't a content creator. I was on the business side of it, but you would meet these guys, and I found them fascinating. And I started to think through, they were looking at their art as really a product. Like, well, this is what audiences want. And we would look at it. This is how audiences test, and so on and so forth. And for the first time, and this is right before COVID, I started to think about, well, gosh, I've never really thought about writing that way. Maybe if I went about it differently and really analyzed what audiences want, and look at how popular novels are structured, or how heroes are sort of constructed, and compare that to what we were starting to see in the evolution of streaming entertainment and this great demand for stories. So I went back to it, and I started, the Handler was, that guy was really he was a frustrated naval intelligence officer who ended up going into the CIA. And because he always wanted to be kinetic, went to ground branch, and along the way met his wife, and she was a case officer, and they eventually got divorced. And then I also wanted to write about human conflict, because at that point, being older, I knew a lot more about that kind of stuff, right? I'd been married for a long time and raised kids, all that sort of thing. So I found all those, taking all that stuff and kind of munging it together, that made me more interested in coming back to writing, and being more organized, and thoughtful about how to actually complete the book, rather than to just play around with prose, which is, I think, what a lot of amateur writers do.
What was it about duty, honor, and sacrifice that inspired you?
Oh, I think those are enduring themes. I'm a patriotic person. I've long believed in the mission of, I've long admired the sacrifice that people make. I'm easily choked up by those kinds of things. And you will find as a writer that you're onto something when you're getting emotional as you're writing. And those are the kinds of themes that get me emotional. It just appeals to me. I think it's an important topic. My the one of my favorite books is Once an Eagle by Anton Meyer. I think that just nailed that theme for military leadership, for leadership, in general. So it's just something I like to write about, and it's something that shows up across all my books.
Pat Hughes, I keep seeing you shaking your head with each of the books that MP mentions. So you have a kindred spirit there. So you would say that John Dale, your main character from The Handler, Dead Drop, as you can see behind, everybody can see behind you. You would say you had an emotional connection to him.
Oh, very much so. I like the idea of a person who had done the right thing, at the time, and then in his case was abused by a bureaucracy. It's also a theme I can't seem to get away from. I spent a lot of time in very large organizations and corporations, et cetera. But at the end of the day is trying to do the right thing for not just the country, but for, the collective world, which I think are often one and the same. And also at a personal level is often trying to do the right thing despite all these obstacles and challenges. And I'm kind of drawn to the idea of the hero who is not necessarily it's not necessarily fully appreciated that what this one person did, right? That's the kind of thing that can get me that can get me going.
This might sound like a noob, as the kids call it, like a beginner question here, but can you explain the difference between espionage and thriller? Are they one and the same?
I think that they can be. I think they're on. It's a spectrum. Or maybe said better, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive categories. So I think you can have an espionage book that doesn't really feel like a thriller, but is thoughtful and clever and so on and so forth. John le Carré wrote in that style, I think quite a bit. And it's not for everybody. And sometimes I can find his books to be a little bit dry, but clever as hell. And the words he strings together are just brilliant.
Tinker
And
Tailor Soldier Spy. That's
yeah,
that's
yeah,
the author.
exactly. And so like there's not a lot of thrills and chills in a book like that. I think the word thriller is a category of novelistic entertainment. And so that means if it is going to be a thriller, I think the assumption is that there will be a climactic scene that kind of keeps you awake. I think that it means there will be a certain level of action, at least as we understand it. So,
Mhm.
thinking like a business person, you are making a brand promise to your consumer when you say, hey, this is such and such. It's a thriller, right? And you're like, okay, got it. There's going to be some action in this book. There's going to be a little bit of mystery. I'm going to wonder how this is all going to resolve. That's not necessarily true of every espionage book, but it is certainly true of many of them.
What would you say you sit in? Do you sit in more of the espionage or the thriller, or kind of that mesh?
Well, certainly the handler I meant to be an espionage thriller, right?
Mhm.
So I wanted to have a character who was realistic in terms of in terms of showing national intelligence procedures, the challenges of somebody who was, out in the field, far away, and deprived of a lot of help, and making that exciting for the reader by invoking action and weapons and, hopefully what comes across as a thrilling climax.
So let's see. I was reading a thing in the chat here. One second. What? How do you incorporate the history into your novels? Like your wargaming, do you do the same thing when as you're setting up your plots?
I try to. So if one of the first things I do is to decide on a geopolitical context. So it could be tension between India and Pakistan. But
Mhm.
nobody ever read a novel where the hero is India or Pakistan or the United States. It's a person, right? So I think you have to understand what is this geopolitical context, and then filter through that to say, now, who are some people that could affect that context, that could push it in one direction or another, or in an unexpected way at a relatable level. So
Mm.
it's like I often like to write about the guy who's, you know, two or three layers down from the person who would be in the news, right? You want somebody who's high enough that they can affect things, but get frustrated by it, and also be sort of invisible from the public. So I kind of forgot the original part of the question. I'm not sure if I answered it completely.
Well, like sort of incorporating history, being a
Oh, history, yeah.
historical fan
And
of
so
yourself. Like,
that's what it was. And so I think as you get into understanding both the geopolitical context and then a person who's in a position, who's in a career to affect that, then you naturally have to understand the history because you have to understand what would be that person's attitude? What would be their worldview and why? What would be the sort of their lived history, things that they would remember? What would be the myths in that country that are super important to people like it? So the next step is to really create to try to bring these characters to life in your own head. And I have this whole process for doing this, but as you're going through, like, okay, here's where the guy went to school. Here's how he thinks about things. Here are his politics. Here's what his family's like. Here's what his wife's politics are, all that kind of stuff. And it's really hard to do that without understanding the history. And so I've been doing a lot of extra education formally to basically get an advanced degree in history because I find it so valuable to writing.
So whenever you get somebody like John Dale, your main character, and we know the thriller or the espionage genre is pretty massive and has these big names, but how do you distinguish your voice or the John Dale character from the James Bonds, the Ethan Hunts, Jack Bauers, Jason Bourne? Um, how do you create your own voice within that?
Yeah, I think if you think about a spectrum of really popular names, Lee Child, for example, writes what's his name? Everybody knows him, Reacher, right? Jack
Yeah.
Reacher. Now, those are enormously successful books, and Jack Reacher is supposedly this army counterintelligence or criminal division or something like that. And it's a little wishy-washy. And if you're a veteran, you read the background on that stuff and you just kind of go, man, it doesn't make a ton of sense to me. That doesn't mean they're not good novels. They're just not really super national security oriented in a realistic way, right? So I think
Hmm.
that that's one end of the spectrum. I think the other end of the spectrum is like the original Tom Clancy's, et cetera. And in between there are these individual heroes who have certain degrees of realism versus not. I wanted to, as a veteran, I wanted to write a character who who was thrust into stuff and have all the intelligence operations feel like they're real, right? Like that's actually possible. That can be done. There are a lot of authors who are popular and they sell well, so I'm not disparaging them because if I could sell as well, I would. But a lot of times they have sort of a magic circle around them of, you know, people and resources that can do everything. And that influences plotting because you're like, okay, well, how did this guy get to the Arctic Circle in 2 seconds and know everything about everything and all that kind of stuff? And it's like, well, because they're part of the special mission force, right? In Mission Impossible, and they have incredible resources that can just do anything. So a lot of the popular authors have set up very fictional sets of resources that the hero can employ. I didn't want to do that. I wanted my heroes to have realistic resources and be very challenged by that, but also for readers to experience that's pretty cool. So that's how that works, huh? Like and let them feel like they got a little bit of a view. And you can do that a little bit through past experience, a lot through interviews from people who've worked in these various fields or just open source intelligence, things like that. That's how I wanted to differentiate was with a set of what they would call authenticity or realism, but that's super important to me.
How long did it take you to finish The Handler, your first novel?
It took a while. It took about a year, I guess, but a lot of that's because I was working, and so much of it was written. Much of it was written in hotel rooms and on flights, and things like that, kind of as an escape because it was fun to think about things other than work, but also trying to apply the same discipline and sort of customer focus that I learned at work to the book and being really ruthless about this belongs in it, this doesn't, etc.
Mhm. So, how and when were you approached by Tom Clancy? And I don't know if you ever actually met Tom Clancy before he passed.
Well, no, so the way that worked is Tom Clancy died in 2014,
Mhm.
and since then the estate has carried on Tom Clancy books, and then they split between there's Tom Clancy senior books and there's Tom Clancy junior books. So it's really two sets of series. And a friend of mine, Mark Greaney, who's a great author and writes the Gray Man series, it's funny, I've discussed this with him. He was really the first guy that got contacted by the Clancy estate through their editors about, hey, we need some help co-writing this, right? There was another guy named Grant Blackwood, and I think it was because Tom Clancy started sort of slowing down in the demands, as he was, aging or whatever. And so that started to happen, and then it became Mark Greaney did like seven of them. It became a kind of a fraternity of authors after that, of which I'm at the latest one. But one thing that didn't change throughout all that was the publisher and the editor. That editor has been the same guy throughout. And so he happened to be the guy that found the handler and did the business deal for the handler and published the handler and was my editor for the handler. And so when an opening came up because another writer left on the Jack Ryan Jr. series, he asked me, "Hey, are you willing to put your own series on hold and do this?" And he's of course I was super interested immediately when he said that and was really happy at that idea. But he goes, before you say yes, realize it's a book like every 7 months. Like this is going to take
Oh.
over everything you're doing. But I wanted to do it. I wanted to do it anyway. But that's how that unfolded.
Are there a different set of rules because you're diving into a big, an established series? Do they have like, the guys who come in and write these now is like, well, Jack Ryan Jr. can't do this, or he shouldn't do this. So you have to kind of avoid these types of like, you have to sort of dance a bit.
Absolutely. I would call them more like guardrails.
Guardrails.
So there's some things around that areas where they want to push the character and change it and evolve it because it shouldn't be the same formula, same thing happening over and over. So for example, I was given the kind of directive like, hey, we want to mature Jack Ryan Jr., right? He's in his mid 30s. He's got a serious girlfriend. When I inherited him, he was engaged. And so it was like, make him feel more like a real person with internal conflicts and things like that. And so that I would differentiate the guardrails from the goals. That was one of the goals. Then there's the sort of to me the gotta haves when representing the Tom Clancy brand, which is that there's got to be geopolitics involved. There's got to be a certain level of, either espionage or military fiction that feels realistic. That needs to be involved. But then getting into some of your guardrails, yeah, there are things like, I whether this is good or bad, I don't know. But a lot of times it's easy for me to imagine a lot of profanity coming out of a character, even if it might not be good. We do very little profanity in, a Clancy book, or you never write Jack Ryan Sr. as, you know, getting something really wrong. You know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
these characters are kind of Boy Scouts. They do things right more than they do them wrong. And so there's a few rules about that. I remember writing some stuff and my editor said, "Well, look, Jack Ryan Jr. would never talk to John Clark that way. Like he's pushing back too much. That's just not going to happen." I'm like, "Oh, okay, right." So you sort of learn the rules of the road about character action. And by the way, I felt like I knew them well because I'd read everything, but
Hmm.
it's a lot different when you start writing them, thinking through how those interactions would occur.
It's interesting because there's, as with a new writer, becomes a reimagining in a way. Like when I knew that we were going to talk to you, I went back and I was like, I need to watch Hunt for Red October. I'd never seen it. I want to see it. So I jumped back and just sort of like got. I knew it was such a popular film, but then I jumped from there and jumped into like the Jack Ryan series on Amazon. A very different Jack Ryan, who is sort of that diamond that figures it out, but may not always have it exactly right because it's maybe a little bit earlier in his career. So I guess the question then becomes, and as we said with like, how do you distinguish your character, John Dale, from all these other famous characters? How do you distinguish your voice, because there were 17 books already of Jack Ryan Jr., and you mentioned Mark Greaney and Grant Blackwood, and there's Mike Maiden and Don Bentley.
Yeah.
How do you distinguish your voice into Jack Ryan as you come into it?
I made a conscious decision that I wanted him to be fallible. You know, one could say flawed, but it's really just growing pains. I think because having reached a certain, age and point in my life, having had a long business career, all these kinds of things, I can sort of look back and think like, what was the dumb stuff I would do when I was, 34, right? That kind of stuff. How would I look at the world? How might I have a conflict between I have this adrenaline for wanting to be out there and do something with I have a family responsibility. I have to build a financial nest egg. I have to, all these other kinds of things. So I wanted to bring a lot of those in internal conflicts into Ryan at the same time that he's doing great things. And as I mentioned, I worked on at Prime Video, and one of the shows that I helped launch was, you know, Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan, there with Amazon Prime Video. And I would say that the John Krasinski portrayal is a lot like a Jack Ryan Jr. I mean, he's similar
Mhm.
age, um, similar sort of outlook, physical ability, et cetera. And so it speaks to the enduring nature of this character. You mentioned the James Bonds of the world, right? How many James Bonds have we seen, right? And so that he happens to be the current personification. But to me, he's kind of a good model for what Jack Ryan Jr. is in the novels.
Interesting side note. If you say they play that fun game, 6 degrees of separation from an actor. I went to school with one of the main actors from that Tom Clancy Jack Ryan series. So I'm 1 degree of separation from John Krasinski, but he did a great
Ah,
job in that
nice.
series. Yeah,
Yeah.
when I was watching the series, like I know that guy. I went to school with him. I actually acted with him in college, but fun times. Um, you have Jack Ryan and you have Jack Ryan Jr., but like, how do you distinguish even those two characters? Because every Jack Ryan is so well established, and then comes along Jack Ryan Jr. Why did there need to be even sort of like these now sort of two? There wasn't like it wasn't a kid's novel, Jack Ryan Jr. It just sort of became this whole separate story that is sort of running in parallel with Jack Ryan.
Yes, and the rules of the road are different for each of those series. So the Jack Ryan senior books they're supposed to have higher level uh, protagonists, people in more positions of power. So in a Jack Ryan senior book, there should be fleets moving, there should be armies deploying, right? It should be kind of not necessarily always a brink of war, but a kind of a national level conflict. In a junior book, it is a little bit more, I would say it's a little bit more character driven because Junior is clearly the hero, right? And he will be in the mix and all that stuff or come across something, but much more at an individual level, which again feels a lot to me more like the Amazon Prime series.
Mhm.
In the Amazon Prime series, it's not in the Oval Office, keep right, and in the Jack Ryan Jr. or the Jack Ryan Senior series of books right now, Jack Ryan Sr. is president. He's been president for quite a while. So the much of the drama is around that sort of diplomatic level, shall we say? Whereas in the junior books, it tends to be a little bit more around the individual out, as opposed to the outer in.
And Jack Ryan Jr., his like origin story is in the book Teeth of the Tiger.
Yeah, it's Teeth of the Tiger. It's also in Terminal Velocity. I'll just hold up a visual aid here. There was a Tom Clancy book that came out called Dead or Alive in 2010, I think. And you
I
can
think
see
you
all
need to make more notes.
I know, and you can see all that. And the reason for that is because when I'm writing the junior series, I always try to make a few callbacks to an original Clancy book. Like in the last one, Line of Demarcation, there are callbacks to Clear and Present Danger, for
Mhm.
example. Yeah, that one. And so in this one, in Terminal Velocity, I wanted there to be callbacks to Dead or Alive, and the reason for that is because it was one of the first times that we see Jack Ryan Jr. operating with a weapon, with John Clark, et cetera, and it was thwarting a big terrorist attempt. So yeah, I like to think about the lineage and to try to do what we might call fan service, right? To keep the whole universe of characters alive and well fed, and to keep the continuities of stories as best we can.
There are some people who might say, well, that's a lot of backstory for me to go back and do. Do I need to read those origin stories
Oh
to pick
no.
up your
Oh
trilogy?
no, no, not at all. It's more like it's more like you might have a fun casual reference here or there. And so someone
Mhm.
who's a super fan who's read that book would go, "Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about," right? But it's not necessarily integral to the current story.
Shadow State, I'm gonna hold it up for everyone. Shadow State being the first of your trilogy with Jack Ryan Jr. What lessons did you learn after, you'd done your two Handler novels, but then diving into Tom Clancy's world? What lessons did you learn about his universe after this novel?
That was the one where, I probably had the most back and forth with my editor, just because I was new at it, in terms of making sure we stay within those rules. And so the relationships function a certain way between Jack Ryan Sr. and John Clark, or Mary Pat Foley and John Clark, or Mary Pat Foley and Jack Ryan Sr., et cetera. So there was learning that, but I purposefully wanted to evolve the Ryan verse, and my editor said that was okay to do. So John Clark is a Navy SEAL who had experience in Vietnam, right? He's getting up there, and so I'm not going to have him jumping out of a C-17 with a knife in his teeth. I needed to create a new character who could kind of serve that role. So I created a Navy SEAL who was I think he was a Master Chief, and had been drummed out of the service under questionable services circumstances, sort of sullied in the media. And I wanted Clark to be his mentor and to be kind of his redeemer. And so I had fun with some of those subplots, with an eye toward that will be a really good character to develop in the future as I continue to write more of these books. So that's Master Chief Kendrick Moore, for example. So I learned there, like, hey, it's okay to introduce new people into this universe, and also to develop other ones who might have had secondary parts in past books. I think that's part of the fun about populating this universe of characters.
And Brad, you asked a good question here in the chat, but I want to expand upon it a bit. He asked what was the reaction has been to your books, and I want to get a little more specific in the sense that something like Star Wars has this enormous fan base, and they bring out the sequel trilogy, and it's panned. The fan base hates it. It has nothing to do with the books and the Star Wars universe that they've been reading for years. And so you have a Clancy universe and a new author and a new voice and introductions of things. How have the fans reacted to what you've added to the legacy?
Quite well, and that's why I continue to get to do them. So I guess the barometer would be the ratings. The ratings have been super strong. So all that's and sales is another barometer, and those have been super strong. All of them have been New York Times bestsellers in the top 10, which is just great, right? Um, you know, that said, there is always a fan who will point out something you got wrong, and we love those. But it can be something fairly prosaic, like, hey, in such and such a book, they established I got one on a communications method they had set up, and I was like, really? Wow, that's okay. That a small detail you brought up from like seven books ago, and the technology might have evolved by then, but I think paying close attention to that as possible is a big deal. But I think that it's okay to evolve. I think as long as you stay within the rules and fulfill the brand promise and write a good novel that fulfills the brand promise, I think that you can add value by freshening things up. I remember, like Sean Connery was like the best James Bond, and then I didn't really care for Pierce Brosnan as much, and I thought I thought the whole series got a little bit cheesy and stale for a while there. Sorry if I'm offending anyone.
No,
And
no,
then,
riding on a surfboard through a hurricane.
yeah, exactly,
Totally,
right.
totally
It's
James Bond.
exactly. And then Daniel Craig came out, right? And he's beating the living crap out of guys in an elevator. And you're just like, whoa. And it was this sort of breath of fresh air. And I'm not saying that I've done that to this series, but I'm just saying that I think audiences in general can react favorably to a slight rejuvenation or bringing something fresh in.
Brad, your other question here in the chat, writer's block. And I mean, the editor's saying, hey, we have to do a 7 month time frame. Is writer's block a serious problem? Have you ever had it?
It is something that occurs. I think that the best remedy is preparation. So if you have here's how I overcome that. If you have written a really good synopsis up front and you've agreed at that sort of high level story across, say, 7 to 10 pages, and then I convert that into an outline that's fairly detailed, and I know it'll get better as I go along. Like I haven't necessarily worked out everything, but I have an idea of how Act One and Act Two and Act Three are going to open and close, and what happens in the midpoints. So those are helpful tools, but the most helpful tool to me is creating a cast of characters and making them feel as real as possible so that sometimes this may sound a little corny, but sometimes I feel like, look, if I can just take a couple of these characters who I really know well and throw them in the same room or in the same scene, I'm just going to let them react, and you just sort of let your imagination take off from there. And a lot of times that can stimulate advancing a story forward because it makes you think through new connections, new conflicts, and those types of things.
Uh, Speaking of fans, how often maybe do you listen to their ideas for what's to come? Do you sort of, listen to what the pulse is of what they're looking for?
I would if I don't really get I've gotten a few of those. And a lot of times it's around, hey, I think that this character should go in this direction, something like that. I
Hmm.
listen to it to a certain extent. I certainly read it all. I more often fan contact is either a compliment or it's a hey, you got this detail wrong. There's a lot of that, and I know in every book, I know we have several Air Force officers. I got the runway wrong on Anderson Air Force Base in Guam, or a recent connection I got, and I'll publicly admit this. Someone pointed out to me that, hey, if it's foreign, it's an air base, not an Air Force base, and so you need to make that distinction. And
Mhm.
I was like, huh, that's interesting. And that came in from a guy who was a JAG, and so he knew what he was talking about. And so you learn something all the time. But boy, I sure try to get everything right, and it's just there's copy editors and there's proofreaders and everything, and still, you'll make a mistake on a gun or something like that. That is one of the most challenging aspects.
The last question I have about the Clancy books, because I know I want to get to Red Tide before we end our time together tonight, but we talked a lot about with our veterans about writing helps to alleviate trauma. I'm not saying that you may have experienced trauma during your Navy career, but does Jack Ryan Jr. deal with trauma in his books? And if so, in what ways does he do that?
I think I don't think that Jack Ryan Jr. is the most damaged traumatically. I think he experiences trauma in his um, personal life, and he deals with in his relationships. And several of the characters I would say are closer to that. Like Kendrick Moore deals with more of that trauma. But to the broader sense, the I think that writing is very therapeutic. I think all art is therapeutic. I do oil painting, and did that long time before writing. I play a couple instruments, you know what I mean? Like all
Mhm.
those things where you can find a creative outlet and take your mind off of whatever the heck it is, swirling on. I find are super helpful. To a certain extent, I started writing as a creative relief because I was traveling and stressed out at work, and it was relaxing for me. And so that isn't battlefield trauma, but it's I think battlefield trauma is taking that to the extreme. So I'm sure that it is something that could be that is therapeutic if used in the right way.
Before we get to Red Tide, it was brought up in the chat, and I noticed it too. There's a statue behind you that catches the eye
Is there? Oh, down there. Yeah.
over on
That
your
that
side.
that one?
Not this statue, but the one
Oh,
that's
that one.
this one. Yeah.
That's a Viking. Yeah, he's a bronze that I found at an antique shop one time, and I just thought he was so cool.
I want to get to like upcoming books. Also, Red Tide's coming out in a couple weeks. I
Yeah.
would love for you to tell us about that because I think our audience here would find it really interesting.
Yeah, so I brought an advanced reader copy with me. This is how books look before they go to hardback. They come out in kind of a paperback that goes around to publishers and media influencers and folks like that. So this is an advanced reader copy of Red Tide. So it's called Red Tide, a novel of the next Pacific War. It's something I worked on over a couple of years, and it's really to our conversation earlier about my experience in the Pacific. Also, my experience as a business executive, I was the president of a Taiwanese manufacturer for a couple of years in the smartphone industry. And so Red Tide is about a conflict that arises between the US and China, not necessarily over Taiwan, but over trade. It begins over trade. That trade happens to be an embargo around semiconductors for advanced, applications like AI. And lo and behold, that's exactly what we've been seeing happening there. The U.S. has put restrictions on exports by NVIDIA into China. And so China sees that as an existential threat. Well, if you know anything about semiconductors, you know that nearly all of them are actually manufactured, including all of NVIDIA's effectively, are manufactured by in Taiwan. So they're Silicon Valley designs chips. They don't manufacture chips. That is all outsourced. And one of the biggest companies that does that is Taiwanese, the TSMC they're called. And so in this book, that trade embargo effectively threatens China into thinking if we don't have advanced access to those advanced things, then we lose economically, we lose militarily, all these things. And so they effectively seize it. And what follows is kind of a Cuban Missile Crisis type of moment around how's this going to play out? Neither side wants to trigger a nuclear war, yet it's clearly tense. And then there's a military escalation, and what unfolds is I would say evocative of the Battle of Midway. One of the things I wanted to point out was in Red Tide is just how dependent both sides are on technology, not only the chips, but the communications that enable the weapon systems. And so I believe that the first casualty in any conflict like that, any kinetic conflict between two big peer powers like that, is going to happen in space and immediately eliminate communications that go to these weapon systems. So we end up with several climactic battles that where both sides are a little bit blinded and sort of struggling to deal with an adjustment in tactics and so forth. And so it's near and dear to my heart. It's very much around that theme of service and sacrifice. It's all told through the eyes of a military family. And as I mentioned earlier, I loved Once an Eagle. That's an inspiration for this book because it's about this family. Also, Winds of War, another inspiration about another family. And so that's Red Tide. It comes out September 23rd. I hope the audience here will check it out.
So very timely, and it's still a novel. It's not in a particular universe, but this is and uh, absolutely something that people are reading in the headlines. So this is like almost wargaming as well.
Yes, yes. This is actually published by the U.S. Naval Institute Press, who was the first publisher of The Hunt for Red October. They were the publisher of Red Storm Rising, and so it's been compared a lot to Red Storm Rising. I was very excited to get a Kyrgyz star it's pretty rare to get a starred review. So this is a different it's a different style of writing, I think, than people are used to seeing, at least from me, in that it's a little bit more of a sweeping, grander story with a lot of family dynamics, but I felt a very important story to tell. And
Mhm.
I think the Naval Institute thought so as well, because it touches on where we stand in terms of readiness, where some of our dependencies are, and it reminds us how important the people are.
So from here, how many books do you have in the oven? And are you continuing in the Clancy universe? Are you continuing in the Handler universe?
Yeah, I have one book that is done, that's in the oven, that is none of the above, and it's an exciting project that I think is going to do really, really well, but I can't talk about it yet. And then I have another book that is not really the Handler universe, but it is similar in that it is a military hero who gets caught up in, so more of a singular hero who gets caught up in espionage, really around Ukraine and the Black Sea, and the Russians, etc. So I'm racing to finish that right now, because I have another Clancy book to write in the future here, that I'm basically through the outline stage on that one. I'm getting ready to go on my research trip to Europe for it. So
Mhm.
those are the ones on my plate at the moment.
Excellent. So other than your personal books, obviously, everybody, please check them out wherever books are sold. Look up MP Woodward. In the Jack Ryan Jr. books. Are there any books? Because, like I said, I'm a sort of a fan of the thriller espionage world genre. Are there any books that you would point me to say you have to read this, this, and this? Like if it's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, or if it's, any of the other ones.
Well, if we're talking about the broad sweep, I really liked Frederick Forsyth, who died fairly recently. But like The Jackal, I thought was a really excellent, well constructed, or Day of the Jackal, I guess it was called, right? That
Mhm.
was a really well constructed thriller, in my opinion. I enjoyed reading one by Ken Follett not too long ago, called Never, and it was interesting in that one, the president of the U.S. was one of the protagonists, and I thought that was pretty good. Of current ones, there's a lot of good authors. I like Jack Carr quite a bit.
That's
Know him.
the Terminal List, the Kurt
He's a
Beaton.
terminalist guy, kind of, also an Amazon partner. Not that I'm at Amazon anymore, but I appreciate his dedication to authenticity in terms of the special forces kind of
Mhm.
writing. And I like David McCluskey's books quite a bit. He's maybe not as well known, but I think he nails that CIA stuff super well. I've enjoyed some John Le Carre books in the past. Mostly I like historical fiction, and to be perfectly honest, mostly I am not able to read a lot of contemporary fiction, because I worry it will influence my own writing style and voice. And I have a lot of Clancy stuff I always have to read for like research, and you're just kind of so busy doing it that I end up reading nonfiction to relax more often, which I realize is somewhat ironic.
Mary Klepper, thank you for the suggestions there. Brad Thor, Vince Flynn, Daniel Silva are all brilliant. I
Yeah.
imagine you guys could all get together and share stories of espionage and thrillers. Maybe that'll be my novel. I'm going to get all of you authors together to solve a world problem.
It is a bit of a community. I enjoy that. All pretty much all the guys that you mentioned, we're more or less in touch, some to greater degrees than others. But I find it to be an interesting community, and a surprisingly supportive one too.
Um, and let's see here. I was just making sure that we didn't have anything else in the chat here. If anyone would like to raise a hand, I'm going to pop over to the gallery view here, and make sure if there's any questions here as we wrap up our time. Hey, Barb, it's good to see you. I didn't notice you in the room. Good to have you here. Um, Brad, I'll ask you to unmute. And Ben, I'll ask you to unmute.
Okay, unmuted.
Brad was Marine Corps. Um, Brad had most of the questions about sort of the intelligence side of things. Brad, did you work with intelligence officers, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, like in the Navy or in the Marine Corps?
Yeah, in the Marine Corps, and Desert Storm was unique in a way that we were flooded with so much intelligence that the commander was almost paralyzed about what to do, make a decision. And sometimes the hard part is, taking everything that you get and trying to filter it down to something actionable. And intelligence officers can be a real gift. A lot of times we put them on the spot by saying, okay, what's going to happen? I mean, they're looking for so much certainty, but at some point it's the commander's call to make the decision. And too much intelligence, although it sounds good by volume, it really needs to be filtered down to something that's really relevant and something that can help the commander. And that's why I was asking what makes a good intelligence officer. Sometimes, you get mixed up in volume and not really the quality of the intelligence sometimes. So, from being on the ground, intelligence is so important, but high volume can really paralyze the mind sometimes. That was the point I was alluding to in my questions.
Yeah, I think Semper Fi, Brad, you still look like a Marine, man. You look like you're on active duty. But I think information overload is absolutely, particularly at deserts. If you think about that period, right, 1991, when digitization was happening, it was almost like there were all these shiny new intelligence toys to be able to go, here's all this stuff coming in from a national level, and yeah, getting through that
Right.
information overload in a timely manner so a commander can make a good decision is it should be something that an intelligence officer would be doing at that time.
Yeah, our mission was to do the infiltration attack through the first Iraqi minefields, to go into Kuwait 2 days before the ground war started. And our commander essentially got paralyzed and eventually had to be relieved because he couldn't make a decision. And so that remembrance really sticks with me because I saw him poring over photographs, poring over maps, poring over
Wow.
reports about where to penetrate this minefield. When the intelligence came in that you're going to run into a fire trap, you're going to get chemical warfare, you're going to get this, and that. And it just seemed to be insurmountable odds, but a decision had to be made where to do the attack. And a new commander came in and said, okay, got it. We're going to attack here, and that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that gets to one of those things too, like from the somebody miles away publishing an intelligence report, they're never going to get fired for erring on the side of caution, it seems to me, right? Whereas the
Right.
the
Yeah.
commander in the field doesn't have that luxury.
Yes. Well,
Uh,
thank you for appearing. Thank you for appearing for us tonight. I got a big reading list now.
Oh, terrific. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Ben, did you fly any of those missions? Air Force picking up canisters launched down from
No,
satellites?
I had a friend that did, and in fact, you can see one of those film canisters in the Udvar Hazy Museum there by Dulles. They in their space section they have one.
What year was that?
I think mostly they were catching with canisters in the 70s and
Yeah,
80s. I think.
that's what I thought. So like not that long ago, it's not like
Right.
the 60s. Yeah.
Yeah, before the digital came along.
And Pat Hughes, I also unmuted you because you seemed like you knew a lot of the books that MP was talking about that he sort of is drawn from. Has that been sort of a passion of yours?
Yeah, I really enjoy him. That Daniel Silva, I'll tell you, he's a jewel in the crown.
Yeah,
And
he's very good.
I like him. I even like Nelson DeMille from time to time, that upcountry uh, that he wrote about Vietnam. I don't know if you've
I
read it.
did, I did read that in that big climactic scene where, well, he clearly had a lot of issues to work out as an author around his service in Vietnam. It was super strong thematically.
Well, he was an officer, as you
Yeah,
well know, and was in Vietnam, and it was a great book.
yeah, it was. He's a good writer. And he passed, right? And I believe his son is writing under his name now.
Well, boy, I miss him. Oh, he's something. Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much. You were wonderful tonight.
Oh, thank you
Very,
so much. That's quite an honor. Thank you.
Barb, I'll ask you to unmute while you're doing that. Greg Yost, I had no doubt you would give us the actual fact. First canister mission was Corona, summer of 1960, and they were still running them into the 1980s. Greg is
Wow.
our Jeopardy champ here, so he always gives us to us straight. Barb, go ahead.
Yeah, so MP Woodward, sorry I missed the first hour of your program. I'll have to go onto YouTube and see what I missed. I want you to press upon you, if you haven't been on VBC before, that it is another jewel in the crown of life. And I wanted to share, I read everything out loud to my husband, all the books that we read, so we know everything at the same time. We discuss lots of things, and quite honestly, we read mostly nonfiction. But because you mentioned Cuban Missile Crisis that my husband was involved in, I think you piqued our curiosity. We'll probably have to check out your book. But I want you to also know, everybody, that Wednesday, my husband and I are driving to Youngstown. We're going to be with Todd for the breakfast event when he talks about the Berlin airlift. Then we're going to drive to Chambersburg and be there on 9/11 when the Italian descendants are going to be there from the film, the Italian POW. We're going to get to meet them, the family members, as well as Francesca, who was in the film, as well as Stephen Mancini, who was the director. And then from there, we go to Baltimore the next day on Saturday for the 6-hour John Brown cruise, the Liberty ship. And then we're going to drive right up to Philadelphia and meet in person Susan Friedenberg. And then she's going to take us to Atlantic City to see her father's memorial. And it's all because of VBC. And I thank you all so much. So thank you, Mr. Woodward. I'm glad I got on for just a couple of minutes. I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Oh, I appreciate that. And sounds like a hell of a trip.
Barb is our well-traveled VBC member. She's all over the place. To everyone here, thank you so much for joining us. And please check out MP Woodward's books, the Handler series, Handler and Dead Drop, the Tom Clancy book, Shadow State, Terminal Velocity, Line of Demarcation, and definitely, was it Red Tide, coming out September 23rd. Sounds like an incredible book. So, MP, thanks for joining me again. It was great catching up with you, and it was fun really getting into the weeds into your intelligence career.
Oh, I really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you. For everyone here, we'll be back Thursday night. We'll be honoring 9/11 that night. So please join us then, and I'll look forward to seeing you all then. Have a great week.
Great job at the helm there, Sean. Great job. Bye-bye.